My family was mocking me while sitting in an expensive restaurant. I doubt a cook with a salary could afford a meal here. That's when I simply called the waiter and said, "Put it on the house." And that's when they realized whose restaurant they were in. You know how some families measure success by bank accounts and corner offices? Well, that was the Callahan family of Boston. Growing up in our house was like living in a constant competition where the prize was parental approval, and let me tell you, I was never even in the running. My parents, Marion and Robert, had this whole blueprint mapped out for their kids. Prestigious universities, respectable careers, country club memberships, and the kind of social status that gets you invited to charity galas. My older brother Nick followed the script perfectly. Harvard MBA, investment banking, penthouse apartment overlooking the harbor. My sister Chris was right behind him with her law degree from Yale and her position at some white shoe firm downtown. Then there was me, Danny, the family screw-up who spent his afternoons hanging around Vinny's kitchen instead of studying for the SATs. While my siblings were padding their resumes with internships at Fortune 500 companies, I was learning how to properly dice onions and why timing matters when you're searing a perfect steak. Vincent Moretti ran this little Italian joint in the North End, nothing fancy, just honest food made with passion. The guy took one look at me when I was 16, awkward and out of place, and somehow saw potential. Maybe it was pity, but I prefer to think he recognized something my own family couldn't see. Vincent became the father figure I never really had at home, patient, encouraging, always pushing me to be better, without making me feel like garbage when I messed up. My parents tolerated my cooking obsession the same way they'd tolerate a mild rash, annoying but hopefully temporary. They kept waiting for me to grow out of it and get serious about my future. Mom would drop hints about how the Henderson's son just got into Wharton, or how the Parker's daughter landed an internship at Goldman Sachs. Dad would leave college brochures on my desk with business programs highlighted in yellow. The breaking point came during my senior year of high school. I'd been accepted to Boston College with plans to major in business administration, which seemed like a reasonable compromise. But then Vincent offered me something that changed everything, a chance to work under Chef Marco at his upscale restaurant downtown. This wasn't just flipping burgers or washing dishes. It was real culinary training with one of the most respected chefs in the city. I remember sitting at our mahogany dining table, the same one where we'd had countless family meetings about grades and expectations, and telling my parents I wanted to defer college for a year to pursue this opportunity. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and Dad's face went through about 5 different shades of red. The lecture that followed lasted 2 hours. I heard about family reputation, wasted potential, and how I was throwing away opportunities that other kids would die for. Nick chimed in with statistics about restaurant failure rates and average chef salaries. Chris, ever the lawyer, presented a logical argument about why this was career suicide. But the worst part wasn't the yelling or the disappointment. It was the way they looked at me, like I was some stranger who'd wandered into their perfectly ordered world and started rearranging the furniture. Vincent tried to reason with them when they showed up at the restaurant unannounced one evening. He explained how rare it was to find someone with natural instincts for flavor and technique, how the culinary world had evolved beyond the stereotypical short-order cook image they had in their heads. He talked about James Beard Awards and Michelin stars, about chefs who become celebrities and built restaurant empires. None of it mattered. To them, cooking was blue-collar work, period. No amount of success stories or industry growth statistics would change their minds. They'd already decided that their youngest son was destined for mediocrity, and nothing I could say would convince them otherwise. The ultimatum came 5 years ago, right after I'd turned down a spot in Northeastern's MBA program. I'd been working at various restaurants around the city, building my skills and saving every penny I could. Vincent had connected me with other chefs who became mentors, and I was finally starting to see a real path forward in the culinary world. Dad cornered me in the garage one Saturday morning while I was working on my beat-up Honda. He gave me the choice in terms that were crystal clear: follow the family plan or find a new family. There was no middle ground, no room for compromise. Either I abandoned this cooking nonsense and went back to school for something respectable, or I was on my own. Looking back, that moment was both the worst and best thing that ever happened to me. Standing there with grease on my hands and my father's disappointed stare burning holes in my soul, I made the hardest decision of my life. I chose myself over their approval. The next morning, I packed everything I owned into 2 duffel bags and moved into a studio apartment above a pizza shop in Somerville. It wasn't glamorous. The place smelled like pepperoni and had radiators that sounded like dying animals. But it was mine. Walking away from my family wasn't just about pursuing a career in cooking. It was about refusing to live someone else's version of my life. Sure, I lost the safety net, the family connections, and the comfortable middle-class lifestyle I'd grown up with. But I gained something more valuable, the freedom to succeed or fail on my own terms. That night, as I lay on an air mattress listening to my upstairs neighbor's TV through paper-thin walls, I made myself a promise. Someday, somehow, I'd prove that following your passion wasn't career suicide. I'd show them that there was more than one way to measure success. Those next 5 years were like boot camp, business school, and therapy all rolled into one brutal package. If you think culinary school is tough, try learning the restaurant business from the ground up while living paycheck to paycheck in one of America's most expensive cities. My studio apartment above Tony's Pizza became my headquarters for what I now call the hustle years. The place was basically a glorified closet with a hot plate, but it was home. I'd wake up at 4 a.m. to prep vegetables at a downtown breakfast joint, work lunch service at a casual dining place in Back Bay, then finish my day washing dishes at an upscale steakhouse until 2 a.m. The breakfast gig was my bread and butter, literally. I'd slice tomatoes, chop onions, and prep bacon until my hands cramped, all while dodging the temperamental head cook who threw spatulas when orders backed up. The pay was garbage, but I learned speed and efficiency. Nothing teaches you to work under pressure, like a line of hungry office workers waiting for their egg sandwiches during morning rush hour. Lunch service taught me about volume and consistency. We'd pump out hundreds of burgers and salads, and every single one had to look identical. The chef there, Maria Santos, was this tiny Puerto Rican woman who could outwork anyone half her age. She showed me how to taste test everything, how to adjust seasoning on the fly, and most importantly, how to maintain quality when you're slammed with orders. But the real education happened at Sullivan's Steakhouse during dinner service. This place was old-school Boston, leather banquettes, dim lighting, and clientele who expected perfection with their $40 ribeyes. I started in the dish pit, which sounds glamorous until you're elbow deep in scalding water for 8 hours straight. The executive chef, Robert Chun, barely acknowledged my existence for the first 6 months. I was just another dishwasher in a long line of college kids and burnouts who cycled through the position. But I watched everything: how the grill cooks manage their stations, how the sauce chef balanced flavors, how the pastry team timed their desserts to coincide with entrees. My breakthrough came during a particularly crazy Saturday night. One of the line cooks called in sick, and they were desperate for bodies. Robert needed someone to handle vegetables and basic prep work. I volunteered, even though my shift wasn't supposed to start for another 2 hours. That night, I learned what real kitchen pressure felt like. Orders were flying in faster than we could keep up. The dinner rush at Sullivan's was like watching a perfectly choreographed dance, except half the dancers were on fire, and the other half were having nervous breakdowns. But somehow, in that chaos, everything clicked for me. The rhythm, the timing, the controlled aggression, it all made sense. Robert noticed that I didn't panic when things got hectic. While other newbies froze up or made mistakes, I found my groove and stayed calm. By closing time, he pulled me aside and offered me a permanent spot on the line. It meant giving up my breakfast job, but the pay bump would cover the difference. Working the line at Sullivan's was like getting a master class in American cuisine every single night. I learned the fundamentals, proper knife techniques, sauce preparation, meat temperatures, and 1,000 little details that separate good food from great food. But more than the technical skills, I was absorbing the business side of restaurants. I'd stick around after my shift to help with inventory and ordering. I volunteered for prep work on my days off. I asked questions about food costs, profit margins, and menu development. Most chefs would have told a line cook to mind his own business, but Robert saw something in me that reminded him of his younger self. He started lending me cookbooks and food magazines. We'd talk about flavor profiles and cooking techniques during slow periods. He even let me experiment with specials on quiet weeknights, teaching me how to develop dishes that would appeal to our particular clientele while maintaining healthy profit margins. The real game changer came during my third year at Sullivan's. I'd been promoted to sous chef, which sounds impressive until you realize it mostly meant longer hours for slightly better pay. But the position gave me access to the business operations, supplier relationships, cost analysis, staff scheduling, and customer feedback. I started developing my own style during this period, focusing on what I call elevated comfort food. Think mac and cheese made with aged Vermont cheddar and pancetta, or meatloaf glazed with bourbon and brown sugar. I was taking dishes that regular Americans grew up loving and giving them the fine dining treatment without losing their soul. Robert let me create a monthly special menu featuring my interpretations of classic American dishes. The response was incredible. Customers started asking specifically for my creations, and food bloggers began mentioning Sullivan's as a place to watch for innovative American cuisine. That's when Marcus Antonelli walked into my life. Marcus was a local investor who'd made his fortune in tech before the dot-com bubble burst. He was one of those guys who decided to get into restaurants because he loved food and had money to burn. Most chef-investor partnerships end badly, but Marcus was different. He actually understood the business. He'd been coming to Sullivan's regularly, always ordering from my special menu. One night, he asked to speak with whoever was creating these dishes. Robert brought him back to the kitchen during a quiet moment, and Marcus spent an hour talking with me about food philosophy, business models, and my long-term goals. The conversation that followed changed everything. Marcus wasn't just another rich guy looking for a trendy investment. He'd done his homework on the Boston restaurant scene and identified a gap in the market for upscale American comfort food. He'd been searching for the right chef to partner with, someone who understood both the culinary and business sides of the equation. His proposition was straightforward, but risky. He'd provide the capital and business expertise. I'd handle the culinary vision and day-to-day operations. We'd split ownership 50-50 initially, with the option for me to buy him out once the restaurant became profitable. It was everything I'd been working toward, but it also meant leaving the security of Sullivan's for the uncertainty of entrepreneurship. The decision should have been obvious, but I spent weeks agonizing over it. Starting a restaurant is like jumping out of an airplane and building your parachute on the way down. The failure rate is astronomical, and even successful places can go under due to factors beyond your control. Economic downturns, bad reviews, or just shifting neighborhood demographics. But Marcus had found a perfect location in the South End, a neighborhood that was gentrifying rapidly, but still maintained its character. The space had been a failed French bistro, which meant the basic infrastructure was already in place. With some renovation and a complete concept overhaul, we could be open within 6 months. I gave Robert my notice on a Thursday morning in March. He wasn't surprised. Good chefs don't stay sous chefs forever, and he'd been preparing for my eventual departure since the day Marcus first approached me. He even offered to help with the transition and provide references for any staff I wanted to poach. The next 12 months were the most intense period of my life. We gutted the old bistro and rebuilt it from the ground up, creating a space that felt both sophisticated and welcoming. The design was modern American, exposed brick, reclaimed wood, industrial lighting, an open kitchen that let diners watch the action. Developing the menu was the fun part. I spent months testing recipes, adjusting portions, and calculating food costs. Every dish had to tell a story about American food culture while being profitable enough to keep the lights on. We went through dozens of iterations before settling on a menu that balanced familiar comfort with culinary innovation. Opening night arrived faster than I expected, and somehow we pulled it off without any major disasters. The local food critics showed up within the first month, and their reviews were better than I dared to hope. Within 6 months, we were booked solid on weekends and developing a waiting list for prime dining slots. The success was intoxicating, but also overwhelming. I was working 16-hour days, managing staff, dealing with suppliers, and trying to maintain quality while scaling up operations. But for the first time in my adult life, I was building something that belonged to me. The real validation came when I was able to buy out Marcus after just 18 months. The restaurant was profitable enough that I could secure a loan for his share, making me the sole owner of what had become one of Boston's hottest dining destinations. I kept the arrangement quiet, partly for tax reasons, but mostly because I wanted to see how people would treat me if they thought I was just another chef rather than a successful businessman. That decision would prove more revealing than I ever imagined. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing inventory reports in my office above the restaurant. Chris's voice had that particular tone she used when she wanted something. Sweet on the surface, but with an undertone that suggested you'd better say yes, or deal with consequences later. She was getting married to Bradley Morrison, some finance guy she'd met at a charity auction. The engagement had been a whirlwind romance, at least according to her Instagram posts, and now she wanted to celebrate with the whole family. The location she'd chosen for this momentous occasion? My restaurant. The irony was so thick you could serve it as dessert. Of course. Chris had no idea she was booking a table at her estranged brother's place. To her, Callahan's Kitchen was just another trendy spot that had been getting buzz in the local food magazines. She'd seen it featured in Boston Magazine's Best New Restaurants issue and decided it would be perfect for impressing Bradley's family. When she called to make the reservation, she'd spoken to my hostess, Jennifer, and specifically requested a table that would show they could afford the finer things in life. The whole thing was so perfectly Chris that I almost laughed out loud. She was literally trying to use my success to impress people without knowing it was mine. I could have easily avoided the whole situation. A simple scheduling conflict, a mysterious plumbing emergency, anything to keep from having to sit through what I knew would be an uncomfortable evening. But something about the situation intrigued me. After 5 years of silence from my family, here was a chance to observe them in their natural habitat without the complications of revealed identity. The night of the dinner, I made sure to position myself where I could watch their table without being obvious about it. I briefed my staff about the situation. They knew this was my family, but had strict instructions to treat them like any other customers. No special treatment, no acknowledgement that I was anything more than a guy who occasionally emerged from the kitchen to check on things. Chris arrived first, of course, because she never missed an opportunity to make an entrance. She brought Bradley along for moral support, and probably to help foot the bill. My parents showed up exactly on time, Dad in his navy blazer and Mom in her pearls, looking like they'd stepped out of a country club catalog from 1985. Nick arrived fashionably late with his girlfriend of the month, some marketing executive named Ashley, who kept taking photos of her food for social media. The whole scene was so stereotypically my family that I felt like I was watching a documentary about upper-middle-class Boston dining rituals. From my vantage point in the kitchen, I could hear fragments of their conversation through the service window. Chris was holding court, showing off her engagement ring, and talking about wedding plans that sounded more expensive than my restaurant's annual revenue. Bradley was name-dropping clients and talking about market volatility, like he was personally responsible for the Dow Jones. Mom and Dad were playing their usual roles, Mom gushing over wedding details and Dad grilling Bradley about his financial prospects with all the subtlety of a tax audit. Nick was being his typical sardonic self, making jokes that weren't quite funny enough to laugh at, but weren't quite mean enough to call out. The conversation inevitably turned to me, the family black sheep who'd thrown away a potential to play with food for a living. I watched Chris gesture dismissively as she explained to Bradley how her youngest brother had dropped out of business school to become a chef. The way she said chef made it sound like a communicable disease. What happened next was like watching a nature documentary about rich people in their native environment. Chris started critiquing every aspect of the meal with the confidence of someone who'd watched a few episodes of Top Chef and considered herself an expert. The appetizers were too small for the price point. The wine list was pretentious. The service was trying too hard to be sophisticated. Bradley joined in with his own observations about restaurant economics and profit margins, clearly trying to impress my father with his business acumen. He speculated about the owner's overhead costs and questioned whether the portions justified the pricing. Dad nodded along like Bradley was delivering profound insights about the food service industry. The most painful part was listening to them dissect dishes I created personally. Chris complained that the short rib was too rich and questioned why anyone would put truffle oil on mac and cheese. Bradley wondered aloud whether the chef was just following trends rather than developing original concepts. They were basically criticizing my life's work without realizing it. The breaking point came during dessert service. Chris had ordered our signature chocolate bourbon pecan pie, which was my grandmother's recipe elevated with premium ingredients and modern presentation techniques. It was one of my most personal dishes, connecting my current success to my childhood memories of helping Grandma Callahan in her kitchen. But Chris took one bite and immediately launched into a critique about how it was too sweet and the bourbon flavor overwhelmed the pecans. She suggested that the chef probably wasn't from the South and didn't understand traditional dessert balance. Bradley agreed, adding that authentic regional cuisine required cultural knowledge that most urban chefs lacked. Sitting there listening to them tear apart something that meant so much to me personally, I felt the familiar burn of family disappointment. But this time, instead of feeling ashamed or defensive, I felt something different, a kind of calm certainty that I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. When Jennifer brought the check to their table, I could see the exact moment when sticker shock set in. Bradley's eyes widened slightly as he calculated his share of the bill. Chris made a show of examining the itemized receipt, questioning whether they'd been charged correctly for wine pairings, and wondering aloud about the automatic gratuity. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Chris looked around the table and asked how we were splitting the bill, then made a pointed comment about hoping everyone could afford their portion. She specifically looked toward where she thought I was sitting and made some remark about how chefs' salaries probably didn't stretch to cover meals at places like this. The assumption was clear. Poor Danny couldn't possibly afford to eat at the same restaurants as his successful siblings. It was the same condescending attitude I'd grown up with, just dressed up in adult sophistication. They still saw me as a family failure who'd chosen a blue-collar career over white-collar respectability. That's when I decided it was time to end this little experiment in family dynamics. I'd learned everything I needed to know about how they really felt, and more importantly, I discovered how much their opinions had stopped mattering to me. I caught Jennifer's eye and gave her the signal we'd discussed earlier. She walked over to their table with the kind of professional smile that hides 1,000 secrets, ready to deliver a surprise I'd been planning all evening. The look on their faces when they found out the truth was going to be absolutely priceless. Jennifer approached their table with the kind of professional composure that comes from years of dealing with difficult customers. She placed a leather check folder in front of Bradley, since he'd been making all the alpha male gestures about handling the bill throughout the evening. I watched in the kitchen as Bradley opened the folder, probably expecting to negotiate payment methods or question specific charges. But instead of a bill, he found a handwritten note on restaurant letterhead that simply read, "Compliments of the house. Welcome to Callahan's Kitchen." The confusion on his face was immediate. He looked up at Jennifer with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle without all the pieces. Mom and Dad leaned in to see what was happening, while Chris grabbed the folder to examine the note herself. Jennifer maintained her professional smile as Chris demanded an explanation. There had to be some mistake. They hadn't won any contests or qualified for any promotional offers. Why would an upscale restaurant comp an entire meal for a table of strangers? That's when I made my entrance. I walked out of the kitchen in my chef's whites, the same uniform I'd been wearing for years, but which suddenly carried a different weight. The dining room wasn't particularly crowded for a Tuesday night, so my appearance drew attention from several tables. I approached their table with the kind of confidence that comes from finally owning your own story. The looks of confusion on their faces shifted to recognition, then to something approaching shock as the pieces started falling into place. Chris was the first to find her voice, though it came out as more of a croak than actual speech. She managed to stammer out something about not knowing I worked there, while her eyes darted around the dining room, as if looking for hidden cameras or some indication this was an elaborate prank. Bradley, trying to maintain his composure, asked if I was the chef who prepared their meal. His tone suggested he was still hoping this was some sort of coincidence. Maybe I was just a line cook who'd been promoted to kitchen manager or something equally non-threatening to his worldview. I let the moment hang in the air for a few seconds before responding. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply state facts and let other people process the implications on their own timeline. When I confirmed that I was not only the chef but also the owner of the restaurant they've been critiquing all evening, the silence that followed was so complete you could hear a souffle fall. Dad's face went through several different colors, settling on a shade of red that suggested his blood pressure medication might need adjustment. Mom's reaction was perhaps the most telling. She immediately started looking around the dining room with new eyes, taking in the packed tables, the professional service, and the obvious signs of success she'd somehow missed earlier. You could practically see her mental calculator recalibrating my net worth in real time. Nick, to his credit, was the first to recover enough to actually speak. He made some joke about how this explained why the food was actually decent, which was his way of acknowledging the situation without having to admit he'd been wrong about anything fundamental. But it was Chris's reaction that really drove the point home. She went into immediate damage control mode, tried to reframe her earlier criticisms as helpful feedback rather than dismissive judgments. Suddenly, the dishes she'd been complaining about became interesting interpretation choices and bold flavor profiles that might not appeal to everyone. Bradley, meanwhile, was doing rapid calculations about what this revelation meant for his relationship with the family. His finance bro instincts kicked in as he started asking questions about revenue streams, profit margins, and expansion plans. He'd gone from dismissing me as a failed line cook to treating me like a potential networking opportunity in about 30 seconds. Dad's response was the most predictable and also the most infuriating. He immediately started taking credit for my success, claiming that the business principles he'd tried to teach me had obviously paid off after all. According to his instant revisionist history, he'd always supported my entrepreneurial spirit and seen potential in my chosen career path. I let them cycle through their various reactions without interrupting. This was their moment to process the cognitive dissonance of discovering that the family disappointment had built something more successful than any of them had achieved individually. The entertainment value alone was worth 5 years of family silence. When Mom finally found her voice, she wanted to know why I'd never told them about the restaurant. Her tone carried the familiar note of injury that suggested I'd somehow wronged her by not sharing information she'd never bothered to ask for. The irony of being accused of secrecy by people who'd cut off contact was apparently lost on her. Chris's fiancé was having his own revelation about what this meant for their wedding planning. He'd been bragging all evening about the connections and resources his new family could provide, and suddenly realized he was sitting across from someone who might actually have more social capital in the city than he did. The most satisfying moment came when Dad asked how I'd managed to finance the restaurant purchase. His question carried the assumption that I must have gotten lucky with investors or inherited money from some relative they didn't know about. The possibility that I'd earned it through skill and hard work didn't seem to compute. When I explained that I bought out my initial investor partner, using profits from the first year of operation, you could see the mental gears grinding as they tried to process what that meant in terms of actual financial success. Restaurant ownership might not fit their definition prestige, but the numbers didn't lie. Bradley, ever the finance guy, started peppering me with questions about cash flow and profit margins. His tone had shifted from condescending to curious, with an undertone that suggested he was mentally filing away information for future reference. Nothing changes a banker's attitude toward you like proving you understand business fundamentals. Chris, meanwhile, was having what appeared to be a minor identity crisis. Her entire understanding of family dynamics was built around the assumption that she and Nick were the successful ones while I was the cautionary tale. Discovering that the cautionary tale had actually written a better story than any of theirs was clearly requiring some mental adjustments. Nick's girlfriend Ashley, who'd been documenting every course on social media, suddenly realized she'd been posting photos from a restaurant owned by someone at her table. She started asking questions about getting behind-the-scenes access for her food blog, clearly seeing an opportunity to leverage this unexpected connection. But the real revelation came when I calmly explained that I deliberately kept my success quiet because I wanted to see how they'd treat me if they thought I was still struggling. The experiment had answered questions I'd been carrying around for 5 years, and the results were exactly what I'd expected. The conversation that followed was awkward in the way that family conversations become when everyone realizes they've been operating under false assumptions. There were apologies that didn't quite feel sincere, explanations that revealed more than they intended, and a general atmosphere of people trying to save face while recalibrating their understanding of family hierarchy. Dad's attempts to rewrite history were particularly transparent. According to his new narrative, he'd always known I had entrepreneurial potential and had only been pushing me toward traditional paths because he wanted me to have a stable foundation. The fact that he'd given me an ultimatum 5 years earlier was conveniently omitted from this revised version of events. Mom's response was more emotional but equally problematic. She wanted to know why I'd let them think I was failing when I was actually building something impressive. Her hurt feelings about being excluded from my success ignored the fact that they'd excluded themselves by cutting off contact when I chose my own path. The evening was winding down, but I could tell this conversation was far from over. I'd succeeded in proving my point, but now I had to figure out what came next in these newly complicated family dynamics. Standing there watching my family process their new reality, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete emotional detachment from their approval. The validation I'd spent my 20s craving suddenly seemed irrelevant. Their shock, their attempt to save face, their immediate pivot to claiming credit. None of it touched me the way it would have even a year earlier. I excused myself from the table and headed back to the kitchen, partly to check on the evening service, but mostly to give them time to process what had just happened. The kitchen was hitting its stride for the dinner rush, and watching my team execute the menu I created gave me more satisfaction than any family reconciliation could provide. Through the service window, I could see them at their table, engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion. Chris was gesturing dramatically, while Bradley looked like he was mentally recalculating social dynamics. Mom and Dad were having one of their quiet married couple arguments where they disagree without actually raising their voices. Nick seemed to be enjoying the chaos, probably because it meant he wasn't the center of family drama for once. About 20 minutes later, Jennifer found me in the prep area, going through tomorrow's special orders. She had that look servers get when they're about to deliver news that's either very good or very bad, with no middle ground. Apparently, my family wasn't ready to leave. Chris had sent word through Jennifer that she needed to speak with me privately before they went home. The request had that familiar tone of Chris expecting immediate accommodation, but Jennifer's diplomatic phrasing suggested there might be more to it than typical sibling manipulation. I finished reviewing the seafood delivery schedule and walked back out to the dining room, where most of the other tables had cleared out for the evening. My family was still sitting there, looking like they were in the middle of a corporate board meeting rather than the end of a social dinner. Chris stood up when she saw me approaching, which was unusual enough to get my attention. She wasn't someone who typically showed deference to anyone, especially her younger brother. But something about her posture suggested this wasn't going to be another attempt to establish dominance through superior attitude. What she said next caught me completely off guard. She apologized, not the half-hearted, sorry if you were offended, non-apology that families specialize in, but an actual acknowledgement that she'd been wrong about my career choice and had treated me poorly because of her own narrow definitions of success. The apology felt genuine, but what came next felt even more significant. Chris explained that her event planning company had been looking for a restaurant partner for high-end wedding receptions and corporate events. She'd been researching Boston's food scene for months, trying to find someone who could handle upscale catering without the usual downtown hotel restrictions. She wanted to know if I'd be interested in discussing a business partnership, not charity, not family obligation, but a legitimate professional collaboration based on mutual benefit. Her company would handle event coordination and client management. My restaurant would provide food service and venue space for private parties. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. 5 years after cutting me out of the family for choosing cooking over conventional success, she was asking to build a business relationship around the very skills they dismissed as worthless. Bradley chimed in with his own perspective, explaining that he'd been looking for investment opportunities in the hospitality sector. His finance background could help with expansion planning and capital allocation if I ever wanted to open additional locations or franchise the concept. Dad's contribution was more awkward, but equally revealing. He admitted that he'd been wrong about the restaurant industry's potential and wanted to help however he could. His offer to leverage his business connections felt like an attempt to rebuild bridges, even though we both knew his networking circles probably wouldn't overlap much with my target demographic. Mom's response was purely emotional, which was actually the most honest reaction of the evening. She just wanted her family back together and didn't care about the business implications. Her tears felt real in a way that the earlier explanations and justifications hadn't. Nick, predictably, had the most practical perspective. He pointed out that family businesses either strengthen relationships or destroy them completely, with very little middle ground. His warning carried weight because he'd seen enough corporate family dynamics to know how quickly professional partnerships can turn personal. I listened to all their offers and explanations without committing to anything. Part of me was tempted by the business opportunities. Chris's event planning connections could definitely help expand my catering revenue, and Bradley's financial expertise might be valuable for future growth. But a bigger part of me was wary of mixing family dynamics with business relationships. The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from wedding catering logistics to franchise development strategies. But the subtext was really about whether we could rebuild a family relationship that had been broken for 5 years, and whether professional collaboration could coexist with personal boundaries. Eventually, we reached a tentative agreement to start small. Chris would send me information about a few upcoming events that might be good fits for collaboration. Bradley would review my business plan and provide feedback on expansion possibilities. We'd treat everything as a professional relationship first and see if family dynamics could develop naturally from there. As they were getting ready to leave, Chris pulled me aside for one final conversation. She admitted that seeing my success had forced her to reconsider a lot of assumptions about family, career choices, and what it means to support someone you love. Her engagement to Bradley had made her think about building new relationships while maintaining old ones, and she didn't want to start her marriage carrying regrets about family members she'd pushed away. Her request was simple but significant. She wanted me to cater the rehearsal dinner for her wedding, not because she needed to save money or because she was obligated to include family, but because she genuinely believed my food would make the celebration more meaningful. It would be a chance to show Bradley's family what the Callahan name could represent when we actually worked together instead of against each other. The wedding catering job would also serve as a test case for our potential business partnership. If we could successfully collaborate on something that mattered personally to her, it might indicate whether we could build a sustainable professional relationship. I agreed to cater the rehearsal dinner, with the understanding that this was a business transaction first and a family gesture second. We'd handle contracts, payments, and logistics the same way I would with any other client. If it worked out well, we could discuss more extensive collaboration. If it didn't, we'd at least have tried to rebuild our relationship on adult terms. Walking back into my kitchen after they left, I realized that this evening had accomplished something I hadn't expected when Chris first made the dinner reservation. It wasn't just about proving my success or getting revenge for years of dismissive treatment. It was about establishing a new dynamic where we could interact as equals rather than falling back into childhood patterns of competition and judgment. The real victory wasn't their recognition of my professional achievements. It was the fact that I no longer needed their recognition to feel successful. I'd built something meaningful on my own terms, and whether they appreciated it or not didn't change the fundamental satisfaction of that accomplishment. Thanks for listening to this wild story about family, food, and finding your own path in life. Sometimes the people who doubt you the most are the ones closest to you, but that doesn't mean you should stop believing in yourself. What do you think? Should Danny work with his family or keep his distance? Have you ever had to prove yourself to people who didn't believe in your dreams? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life tales. Your support keeps these stories coming, and I love hearing your perspectives on these crazy family situations we all deal with. Until next time, keep chasing those dreams, even when nobody else gets it.